The Analogues by Damon originally published in the January 1952 issue of Astounding Science Fiction magazine, republished in several anthologies including 13 Great Stories of Science Fiction in 1960, which had 6 successive editions throughout the 70s, the Vintage Anthology of Science Fantasy in 1966, and The 50s, The End of Summer in 1979. It was included in The Best of Damon in 1976, a collection which has thus far had 7 reissues through the years. Read by Darrell T. Smith II from my channel Quasar Spectra. The Analogues. The creature was like an eye, a globular eye that could see in all directions, encysted in the gray, cloudy mind that called itself Alfie Strunk. In that dimness, thoughts squirmed like dark fish darting, and the eye followed them without pity. It knew Alfie, knew the evil in Alfie, the tangled skein of impotence and hatred and desire. The equation, love equals death. The roots of that evil were beyond its reach. It was only an eye, but now it was changing. Deep in its own center, little electric tingles came and went. Energy found a new gradient and flowed. A thought shone in the gray cloud that was Alfie, only half-formed but unmistakable, and a channel opened. Instantly, the eye thrust a filament of itself into the passage. Now it was free. Now it could act. The man on the couch stirred and moaned. The doctor, who had been whispering into his ear, drew back and watched his face. At the other end of the couch, the technician glanced alertly at the patient, then turned again to his meters. The patient's head was covered to the ears by an ovoid shell of metal. A broad strap of webbing, buckled under his jaw, held it securely. The heads of screw clamps protruded in 3 circles around the shell's circumference, and a thick bundle of insulated wires issued from its center, leading ultimately to the control board at the foot of the couch. The man's gross body was restrained by a rubber sheet, the back of his head resting in the trough of a rubber block fixed to the couch. "No!" he shouted suddenly. He mumbled, his loose features contorting. Then, "I wasn't gonna... No! Don't!" He muttered again, trying to move his body, the tendons in his neck sharply outlined. "Please," he said, and tears glittered in his eyes. The doctor leaned forward and whispered in his ear, "You're going away from there. You're going away. It's 5 minutes later." The patient relaxed and seemed to be asleep. A teardrop spilled over and ran slowly down his cheek. The doctor stood up and nodded to the technician, who slowly moved his rheostat to 0 before he cut the switches. "A good run," the doctor mouthed silently. The technician nodded and grinned. He scribbled on a pad. "Test him this aft?" The doctor wrote, "Yes. Can't tell till then, but think we got him solid." Alfie Strunk sat in the hard chair and chewed rhythmically, staring at nothing. His brother had told him to wait here while he went down the hall to see the doctor. It seemed to Alfie that he had been gone a long time. Silence flowed around him. The room he sat in was almost bare. The chair he sat in, the naked walls and floor, a couple of little tables with books on them. There were 2 doors. One, open, led into the long, bare hall outside. There were other doors in the hall, but they were all closed, and their windows were dark. At the end of the hall was a door, and that was closed too. Alfie had heard his brother close it behind him with a solid click when he left. He felt very safe and alone. He heard something, a faint echo of movement, and turned his head swiftly, automatically. The noise came from beyond the second door in the room, the one that was just slightly ajar. He heard it again. He stood up, cautiously, not making a sound. He tiptoed to the door, looked through the crack. At first, he saw nothing. Then the footsteps came again, and he saw a flash of color, a blue print skirt, a white sweater, a glimpse of coppery hair. Alfie widened the crack very carefully. His heart was pounding, and his breath was coming faster. Now he could see the far end of the room, a couch, and the girl sitting on it, opening a book. She was about 11, slender and dainty. A reading lamp by the couch gave the only light. She was alone. Alfie's blunt fingers went into his trousers pocket and clutched futilely. They had taken his knife away. Then he glanced at the little table beside the door, and his breath caught. There it was, his own switchblade knife, lying beside the books. His brother must have left it there and forgotten to tell him. He reached for it, and an angry female voice said, "Alfie!" He whirled, cringing. His mother stood there, towering twice his height, with wrath in her staring gray eyes, every line of her so sharp and real that he could not doubt her, though he knew she had been dead these 15 years. She had a willow switch in her hand. "No!" gasped Alfie, retreating to the wall. "Don't! I wasn't gonna do nothing!" She raised the switch. "You're no good, no good, no good," she spat. "You've got the devil in you, and it's just got to be whipped out." "Don't, please," said Alfie. Tears leaked out of his eyes. "Get away from that girl," she said, advancing. "Get clean away and don't ever go back. Go on." Alfie turned and ran, sobbing in his throat. In the next room, the girl went on reading until a voice said, "Okay, Rita, that's all." She looked up. "Is that all? Well, I didn't do much." "You did enough," said the voice. "We'll explain to you what it's all about someday. Come on, let's go." She smiled, stood up, and vanished as she moved out of range of the mirrors in the room below. The 2 rooms where Alfie had been tested were empty. Alfie's mother was already gone with Alfie, inside his mind where he could never escape her again as long as he lived. Martin's long, cool fingers gently pressed the highball glass. The glass accepted the pressure, a very little. The liquid rose almost imperceptibly inside it. This glass would not break, he knew. It had no hard edges, and if thrown, it would not hurt anybody much. It was a symbol, perhaps, but only in the sense that nearly everything around him was a symbol. The music of the 5-piece combo down at the end of the long room was like a glass, muted, gentle, accommodating, and the alcohol content of the whiskey in his drink was 24.5%. But men still got drunk, and men still reached instinctively for a weapon to kill. And, incredibly, there were worse things that could happen. The cure was sometimes worse than the disease. The operation was successful, but the patient died. "We're witch doctors," he thought. "We don't realize it yet, most of us, but that's what we are. The doctor who only heals is a servant, but the doctor who controls the powers of life and death is a tyrant." The dark little man across the table had to be made to understand that. Martin thought he could do it. The man had power, the power of millions of readers, of friends in high places, but he was a genuine, not a professional lover of democracy. Now the little man raised his glass, tilted it in a quick automatic gesture. Martin saw his throat pulse like the knotting of a fist as he swallowed. He set the glass down, and the soft, rosy light from the bar made dragon's eyes of his spectacles. "Well, Dr. Martin," he said. His voice was crisp and rapid, but amiable. This man lived with tension. He was acclimated to it, like a swimmer in swift waters. Martin gestured with his glass, a slow, controlled movement. "I want you to see something first," he said. "Then we'll talk. I asked you to meet me here for 2 reasons. One is that it's an out-of-the-way place, and as you'll understand, I have to be careful. The other has to do with a man who comes here every night. His name is Ernest Fox. He's a machinist when he works. Over there at the bar, the big man in the checkered jacket. See him?" The other flicked a glance that way. He did not turn his head. "Yeah, the one with the snootful?" "Yes, you're right. He's very drunk. I don't think it will take much longer. How come they serve him?" "You'll see in a minute," Martin said. Ernest Fox was swaying slightly on the bar stool. His choleric face was flushed, and his nostrils widened visibly with each breath he took. His eyes were narrowed, staring at the man to his left, a wizened little fellow in a big fedora. Suddenly he straightened and slammed his glass down on the bar. Liquid spread over the surface in a glittering flood. The wizened man looked up at him nervously. Fox drew his fist back. Martin's guest had half turned in his seat. He was watching, relaxed and interested. The big man's face turned abruptly as if someone had spoken to him. He stared at an invisible something 6 inches away, and his raised arm slowly dropped. He appeared to be listening. Gradually his face lost its anger and became sullen. He muttered something, looking down at his hands. He listened again. Then he turned to the wizened man and spoke, apparently in apology. The little man waved his hand as if to say, "Forget it," and turned back to his drink. The big man slumped again on the bar stool, shaking his head and muttering. Then he scooped up his change from the bar, got up, and walked out. Someone else took his place almost immediately. "That happens every night, like clockwork," said Martin. "That's why they serve him. He never does any harm, and he never will. He's a good customer." The dark little man was facing him alertly once more. "And? A year and a half ago," Martin said, "no place in the loop would let him in the door, and he had a police record as long as your arm. He liked to get drunk, and when he got drunk, he liked to start fights. Compulsive. No cure for it, even if there were facilities for such cases. He's still incurable. He's just the same as he was, just as manic, just as hostile. But he doesn't cause any trouble now." "All right, Doctor, I check to you. Why not?" "But he's got an analog," said Martin. "In the classical sense. He is even less insane than he was before. He has auditory, visual, and tactile hallucinations, a complete integrated set. That's enough to get you entry to most institutions, crowded as they are. But, you see, these hallucinations are pre-societal. They were put there deliberately. He's an acceptable member of society because he has them." The dark man looked interested and irritated at the same time. He said, "He sees things. What does he see exactly, and what does it say to him? Nobody knows that except himself. A policeman, maybe, or his mother as she looked when he was a child. Someone whom he fears and whose authority he acknowledges. The subconscious has its own mechanism for creating these false images. All we do is stimulate it. It does the rest. Usually we think it just warns him, and in most cases that's enough. A word from the right person at the right moment is enough to prevent 99 out of 100 crimes. But in extreme cases, the analogues can actually oppose the patient physically, as far as he's concerned, that is. The hallucination is complete, as I told you. Sounds like a good notion. A very good notion, rightly handled. In another 10 years, it will cut down the number of persons institutionalized for insanity to the point where we can actually hope to make some progress, both in study and treatment, with those that are left. Sort of personal guardian angel, tailored to fit, said the dark man. That's exactly it, said Martin. The analog always fits the patient because it is the patient, a part of his own mind working against his conscious purposes whenever they cross the prohibition we lay down. Even an exceptionally intelligent man can't defeat his analog because the analog is just as intelligent. Even knowing you've had the treatment doesn't help, although ordinarily the patient doesn't know. The analog to the patient is absolutely indistinguishable from a real person, but it doesn't have any of a real person's weaknesses. The other grinned. Could I get one to keep me from drawing to inside straights? Martin did not smile. That isn't quite as funny as it sounds, he said. There's a very real possibility that you could, about 10 years from now, and that's precisely the catastrophe that I want you to help prevent. The tall, black-haired young man got out of the pickup and strolled jauntily into the hotel lobby. He wasn't thinking about what he was going to do. His mind was cheerfully occupied with the decoration of the enormous loft he had just rented on the Lower East Side. It might be better, he thought, to put both couches along one wall and arrange the bar opposite, or put the Kapahari there with an easy chair on either side. The small lobby was empty except for the clerk behind his minuscule desk and the elevator operator lounging beside the cage. The young man walked confidently forward. "Yes, sir," said the clerk. "Listen," said the young man. "There's a man leaning out of a window upstairs, shouting for help. He looked sick." "What? Show me." The clerk and the elevator operator followed him out to the sidewalk. The young man pointed to 2 open windows. "It was one of those, the ones in the middle on the top floor." "Thanks, mister," said the clerk. The young man said, "Sure," and watched the 2 men hurry into the elevator. When the doors closed behind them, he strolled in again and watched the indicator rise. Then, for the first time, he looked down at the blue carpet that stretched between elevator and entrance. It was almost new, not fastened down, and just the right size. He bent and picked up the end of it. "Drop it," said a voice. The young man looked up in surprise. It was the same man that had stopped him yesterday in the furniture store. Was he being followed? He dropped the carpet. "I thought I saw a coin under there," he said. "I know what you thought," the man said. "Beat it." The young man walked out to his pickup and drove away. He felt chilly inside. Suppose this happened every time he wanted to take something? The dark man looked shrewdly at Martin. He said, "All right, doctor, spill the rest of it. Let's have it all, not just the background. I'm not a science reporter, you know." "The Institute," Martin said, "has already arranged for a staff of lobbyists to start working for the first page of its program, when the World Legislature returns to session this fall. Here's what they want for a beginning. 1. Analog treatment for all persons convicted of crime while temporarily insane, as a substitute for either institutionalization or punishment. They will argue that society's real purpose is to prevent the repetition of the crime, not to punish. "They'll be right," said the little man. "Well, of course, but wait. Second, they want government support for a vast and rapid expansion of analog services. The goal is to restore useful citizens to society and to ease pressure on institutions, both corrective and punitive." "Why not?" "No reason why not, if it would stop there, but it won't." Martin took a deep breath and clasped his long fingers together on the table. It was very clear to him, but he realized that it was a difficult thing for a layman to see, or even for a technically competent man in his own field, and yet it was inevitable. It was going to happen, unless he stopped it. "It's just our bad luck," he said, "that this development came at this particular time in history. It was only 30 years ago, shortly after the Third World War, that the problem of our wasted human resources really became so acute that it couldn't be evaded any longer. Since then, we've seen a great deal of progress, and public sentiment is fully behind it. New building codes for big cities, new speed laws, reduced alcoholic content in wine and liquor, things like that. The analog treatment is riding the wave. It's estimated by competent men in the field that the wave will reach its maximum about 10 years from now, and that's when the Institute will be ready to put through the second stage of its progress. Here it is. 1. Analog treatment against crimes of violence to be compulsory for all citizens above the age of 7. The dark man stared at him. "Blue balls of fire," he said. "Will it work on that scale?" "Yes, it will completely eliminate any possibility of a future war, and it will halve our police problem." The dark man whistled. "Then what?" 2, said Martin. "Analog treatment against peculation, collusion, bribery, and all the other forms of corruption to be compulsory for all candidates for public office, and that will make the democratic system foolproof for all time." The dark man laid his pencil down. "Dr. Martin," he said, "you're confusing me. I'm a libertarian, but there's got to be some method of preventing this race from killing itself off. If this treatment will do what you say it will do, I don't care if it does violate civil rights. I want to go on living, and I want my grandchildren, I have 2, by the way, to go on living. Unless there's a catch you haven't told me about this thing, I'm for it." Martin said earnestly, "This treatment is a crutch. It's not a therapy. It does not cure the patient of anything. As a matter of fact, as I told you before, it makes him less nearly sane, not more. The causes of his irrational or antisocial behavior are still there. They're only repressed, temporarily. They can't ever come out in the same way, that's true. We've built a wall across that particular channel, but they will express themselves in some other way, sooner or later, when a dammed-up flood breaks through in a new place. What do? Build another levee." "Exactly," said Martin. "And after that, another and another and another. It's basically wrong." Nicholas Doth, cold sober, stared broodingly at the boulder that stood on trestles between the house and the orchard. It was a piece of New England granite, marked here and there with chalk lines. It had stood there for 8 months, and he had not touched a chisel to it. The sun was warm on his back. The air was still. Only the occasional hint of a breeze ruffled the treetops. Behind him he could hear the clatter of dishes in the kitchen, and beyond that the clear sounds of his wife's voice. Once there had been a shape buried in the stone. Every stone had its latent form, and when you carved it, you felt as if you were only helping it to be born. Doth could remember the shape he had seen buried in this one, a woman and child, the woman kneeling, half bent over the child in her lap. The balancing of masses had given it grace and authority, and the free space had lent it movement. He could remember it, but he couldn't see it anymore. There was a quick, short spasm in his right arm and side, painful while it lasted. It was like the sketch of an action, turning, walking to where there was whiskey, meeting the guard who wouldn't let him drink it, turning away again. All that had squeezed itself now into a spasm, a kind of tic. He didn't drink now, didn't try to drink. He dreamed about it, yes, thought of it, felt the burning ache in his throat and guts, but he didn't try. There simply wasn't any use. He looked back at the unborn stone, and now, for an instant, he could not even remember what its shape was to have been. The tic came again. Doth had a feeling of pressure building intolerably inside him, of something restrained that demanded exit. He stared toward the stone and saw its form drift away slowly into an inchoate gray sea. Then, nothing. He turned stiffly toward the house. "Martha!" he called. The clatter of the dishware answered him. He stumbled forward, holding his arms away from his body. "Martha!" he shouted. "I'm blind!" "Correct me if I'm wrong," said the dark man. "It seems to me that you'd only run into trouble with the actual mental cases, the people who really have strong complications, and according to you, those are the only ones who should get the treatment. Now, the average man doesn't have any compulsion to kill or steal or what have you. He may be tempted to once in his life. If somebody stops him that one time, will it do him any harm? For a minute or two he will have been insane," said Martin. "But I agree with you that if that were the end of it, no great harm would be done. At the Institute, the majority believe that that will be the end of it. They're wrong. They're tragically wrong, because there's one provision that the Institute hasn't included in its program, but that would be the first thought of any lawmaker in the world. Treatment against any attempt to overthrow the government." The dark man sat silent. "And from there," said Martin, "it's only one short step to a tyranny that will last till the end of time." The other nodded. "You're right," he said. "You're so right. What do you want me to do?" "Raise funds," said Martin. "At present the Institute is financed almost entirely by the members themselves. We have barely enough to operate on a minimum scale and expand very slowly, opening one new center a year. Offer us a charitable contribution, tax-deductible, remember, of $500,000, and we'll grab it. The catch is this. The donors, in return for such a large contribution, ask the privilege of appointing 3 members to the Institute's board of directors. There will be no objection to that, so long as my connection with the donation is kept secret, because 3 members will not give the donors control, but it will give me a majority on this one issue, the second stage of the Institute's program." This thing is like an epidemic. Give it a few more years, and nothing can stop it. But act now, and we can scotch it while it's still small enough to handle. Good enough, said the dark man. I won't promise to hand you $500,000 tomorrow, but I know a few people who might reach into their pockets if I told them the score. I'll do what I can. I'll get you the money if I have to steal it. You can count on me. Martin smiled warmly and caught the waiter as he went by. No, this is mine, he said, forestalling the little man's gesture. I wonder if you realize what a weight you've taken off my shoulders. He paid, and they strolled out into the warm summer night. Incidentally, Martin said, there's an answer to a point you brought up in passing, that the weakness of the treatment applies only to the genuinely compulsive cases where it's most needed. There are means of getting around that, though not of making the treatment into a therapy. It's a crutch, and that's all it will ever be. But for one example, we've recently worked out a technique in which the analog appears, not as a guardian, but as the object of the attack. When there is an attack. In that way, the patient relieves himself instead of being further repressed. But he still doesn't harm anybody but a phantom. It's going to be a great thing for humanity, said the little man seriously. Instead of the terrible thing it might have been except for you, Dr. Martin. Good night. Good night, said Martin gratefully. He watched the other disappear into the crowd, then walked toward the L. It was a wonderful night, and he was in no hurry. The waiter whistled under his breath, as unconscious of the conflicting melody the band was playing as he was of the air he breathed. Philosophically, he picked up the 2 untouched drinks that stood at one side of the table and drained them one after the other. If a well-dressed, smart-looking guy like that wanted to sit by himself all evening, talking and buying drinks for somebody who wasn't there, was there any harm in it? No harm at all, the waiter told himself. You've been listening to pre-1990s speculative fiction readings with a highlight on science fiction by Darrell T. Smith II. Please consider clicking the donation link in the description box. Thank you so much for your time and your imagination.